Rain drummed steadily against the hood of Officer James Barrett's patrol car, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched his growing irritation. It was his fourth consecutive Thursday working the downtown beat, an assignment he'd grown to despise. The digital clock on his dashboard blinked 2:47 p.m. Still 3 hours left in his shift. Barrett took another sip of his lukewarm coffee, his third cup of the day, grimacing at the bitter taste. The coffee cart vendor had probably let it sit too long, but Barrett hadn't bothered to complain. He'd been too preoccupied watching the usual parade of courthouse regulars, lawyers, clerks, and what he called the suspicious ones. Through the rain-streaked windshield, his attention fixed on a black man in an impeccable charcoal suit, moving with purpose down the courthouse steps. Something about the man's confident stride made Barrett's jaw clench. The leather briefcase swinging from the man's hand looked expensive. Italian, maybe. A gold Rolex glinted on his wrist, catching what little sunlight pierced the clouds. "Dispatch, this is Unit 473. Barrett spoke into his radio, eyes never leaving the man. "I'm conducting a pedestrian stop on Marion Street, just east of the courthouse." He didn't wait for acknowledgement before pulling his cruiser away from the curb. Officer Sarah Chen, his rookie partner of 3 weeks, shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. She'd already noticed Barrett's patterns, but had kept her observations to herself. "What's the probable cause?" she ventured carefully. Barrett shot her a look that silenced any further questions. "Watch and learn, rookie. Something's not right here." He'd used that line before. It was his favorite way to justify what Chen recognized as profiling, but couldn't yet bring herself to call out. The cruiser's tires splashed through puddles as Barrett pulled alongside the walking man. The pedestrian was tall, probably 6'2", with closely cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that spoke of sophistication. Barrett estimated him to be in his mid-50s, though he carried himself with the energy of someone younger. "Probably dealing high-end stuff," Barrett muttered, more to himself than Chen. "You see guys like this sometimes, trying to blend in around the courthouse. Looking too polished, you know. Too perfect." Chen remained silent, but her discomfort was palpable in the cramped space of the patrol car. Barrett hit the lights, and a small crowd of courthouse employees, leaving for late lunch, began to gather under the shelter of the building's ornate entrance. Some already had their phones out. Recording had become almost reflexive whenever police stopped someone these days. The man in the suit stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. Barrett noticed his shoulders square up, head lifting slightly, body language that spoke of frustration, but also preparation. It wasn't the nervous fidgeting Barrett usually saw during his stops. This was different. This was the stance of someone who knew exactly what was happening and why. "Step out, Chen," Barrett ordered, already opening his door. The rain had picked up, and he could feel droplets sliding down the back of his neck as he emerged. His hand instinctively rested on his holstered weapon, a habit he'd developed over 15 years on the force, though he'd only drawn it twice. The growing crowd of onlookers, the rain, the suited man's rigid posture, it all created a tension that Barrett mistook for validation of his suspicions. This was how it always went. He'd spot something off, make the stop, and usually find something to justify his instincts. His impressive arrest record had insulated him from any serious scrutiny, despite the growing file of civilian complaints. As Barrett approached the man, rain beating on his badge, he had no way of knowing that this routine stop would be his last. He couldn't see the faint smile playing at the corners of the man's mouth, or understand that he was walking directly into a trap years in the making. For now, he was still Officer James Barrett, badge number 6382, about to learn that karma sometimes arrives wearing a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase. "Sir, mind telling me where you're headed in such a hurry?" Barrett's voice carried that practiced tone of artificial politeness, the kind that barely masked underlying hostility. The rain continued its steady drumbeat on the pavement, creating a tense soundtrack to the unfolding scene. Marcus Thompson turned slowly, his movements deliberate and composed. Water droplets beaded on his wire-rimmed glasses, but he made no move to wipe them away. Instead, he reached into his suit jacket with careful precision, noting how Barrett's hand twitched toward his weapon. "I'm removing my credentials," Thompson announced clearly, his voice carrying to the growing crowd of onlookers. From his pocket, he produced a leather wallet, opening it to reveal his Bar Association card alongside his driver's license. The Harvard Law School ring on his finger caught a flash of lightning that split the gray sky. "Marcus Thompson, senior partner at Williams & Reed," he stated, his tone carrying the weight of countless similar encounters. "I'm due in Judge Martinez's courtroom in exactly 8 minutes for a federal case, officer." His eyes flickered to Barrett's nameplate, though he'd known the name long before this moment. Barrett. Barrett's partner, Officer Chen, had positioned herself slightly behind him, her discomfort evident in her stance. She'd been on the force just long enough to recognize the warning signs of a situation spiraling out of control, but not yet long enough to challenge her senior officer. "A lawyer, Barrett's smirk grew wider. "Must be a pretty important case for you to be running through the rain like that." He made a show of examining Thompson's credentials, holding them closer than necessary in the dim light. The crowd had swelled to nearly 30 people now, their phones recording every moment. Thompson checked his Rolex again. 7 minutes until court. "Officer Barrett, I've provided identification and explained my legitimate business at the courthouse. Unless you're charging me with something specific, I'll be on my way." He moved to retrieve his ID, but Barrett pulled back, keeping the credentials just out of reach. "Thing is, Mr. Thompson," Barrett drew out the name with deliberate skepticism, "we've had some issues around here lately. People carrying things they shouldn't be. Important-looking briefcases like yours, expensive suits to blend in." He gestured vaguely at Thompson's attire. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back called out, "He's a regular here." "That's Attorney Thompson." Barrett's jaw tightened at the interference, but Thompson's expression remained unchanged, almost eerily calm. "Officer Barrett." Thompson's voice took on a different tone now, one that made several courthouse veterans in the crowd exchange knowing looks. "Are you suggesting that my appearance, specifically a black man in professional attire, constitutes probable cause for a stop and search?" The question hung in the rain-heavy air. Officer Chen took a small step backward, her rookie instincts screaming that this was about to become more than a routine stop. Barrett, however, was too far committed to his course of action to back down now. "Sir, I'm going to need to see what's in the briefcase." Barrett's hand moved from his weapon to an authoritative pointing gesture at the leather case. "For public safety." Thompson's smile was barely perceptible, but it carried decades of experience and preparation for exactly this moment. "Officer Barrett, I do not consent to any search of my property. You have no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and this stop itself is a clear violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." He shifted the briefcase slightly, water running off its polished surface. "Now, I suggest you return my credentials and allow me to proceed to my court appointment." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed by a low rumble of thunder that seemed to underscore the tension of the moment. Barrett's face hardened. He'd heard enough lawyers quote rights at him over the years to know that backing down now would feel like defeat. His pride, carefully cultivated over 15 years of unchecked authority, wouldn't allow it. "Sir, place the briefcase on the ground." Barrett's command cut through the sound of rain and murmuring onlookers. The leather briefcase remained firmly in Thompson's grip, water streaming down its sides. The crowd had grown larger despite the rain, their collective breath held in anticipation. The courthouse steps had become an impromptu amphitheater, with Thompson and Barrett center stage in an unfolding drama. "Officer Barrett," Thompson's voice carried the weight of countless courtroom victories, "I want to be very clear about what's happening right now." He gestured toward the sea of recording phones. "You are attempting to conduct an illegal search without probable cause, based solely on racial profiling. Every second of this interaction is being documented." Barrett's face flushed red, visible even in the gray afternoon light. The word profiling had struck a nerve. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it, but he'd always managed to justify his actions through carefully worded reports. This time felt different. The crowd's energy had shifted from curious observation to quiet outrage. Officer Chen stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation. "Sir, perhaps we cooled." "Stand down, Chen." Barrett snapped, his composure cracking. "This is my stop, my call." He turned back to Thompson, rain dripping from his police cap. "Last chance. Put the briefcase down, or we'll consider this resistance." Thompson's response was measured but firm. "Officer Barrett, I am a federal court officer on my way to proceedings. Your actions are not only illegal but are actively interfering with the justice system." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The gathering crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people now, including several attorneys Thompson knew by name. Some had moved closer, their phones steady despite the rain, capturing every word, every gesture. A young law clerk whispered urgently into her phone, no doubt calling the judge's chambers about the delay. Barrett's hand returned to his weapon, a move that drew gasps from the onlookers. "Sir, I don't care if you're headed to see the president himself. When an officer gives you a lawful order." "Lawful." Thompson's interruption was sharp, precise. "Please, Officer Barrett, articulate the legal basis for this stop and search. For the record." He gestured to the recording phones. "What specific facts led you to believe I was engaged in criminal activity?" Barrett's partner shifted uncomfortably again, recognizing the practiced tone of a lawyer building a case. This wasn't just any attorney being harassed. This was someone who knew exactly how to handle police overreach, someone who appeared to be almost orchestrating the entire encounter. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Barrett growled, his professional veneer completely cracked. "The briefcase." Now. He took a step forward, hand still on his weapon, rain drumming against his shoulders. Thompson stood his ground, eyes locked with Barrett's. "Officer, I'm going to reach into my suit pocket again. I'm removing my phone to call Police Commissioner Davis. I believe he'll be very interested in what's unfolding here." The name drop was deliberate, calculated. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickered across Barrett's face. Commissioner Davis had been making noise lately about department reform, about cleaning house. But Barrett had come too far to back down now. His pride, his authority, his entire identity as an officer was wrapped up in this moment. "That's it," Barrett snarled, reaching for the briefcase. "You're interfering with a police investigation." His fingers closed around the handle, yanking it toward himself. Thompson released his grip suddenly, causing Barrett to stumble slightly. "Officer Barrett," Thompson's voice was almost gentle now, "you've just assaulted a federal court officer and illegally seized private property. Would you like to compound that by opening the briefcase without consent or a warrant?" The crowd had grown deathly quiet, phones still recording, rain still falling. Officer Chen had taken several steps back, already seeing the career-ending trajectory of her partner's actions. But Barrett, driven by 15 years of unchecked authority and wounded pride, was beyond the point of reason. With trembling hands, he reached for the briefcase locks, about to discover just how completely he'd played into Thompson's carefully laid trap. The briefcase locks clicked open with an ominous finality that seemed to echo across the rain-soaked courthouse steps. Barrett's hands, usually steady from years of weapon training, trembled slightly as he lifted the leather lid. The crowd leaned forward collectively, phones still recording, ready to witness what Barrett was so desperate to find. Inside, meticulously organized, lay a stack of official-looking folders bearing the Memphis Police Department seal. Barrett's fingertips brushed against the top folder, leaving damp marks on the crisp manila surface. His eyes fixed on a name written in bold black letters across the tab. Officer James Barrett, #6382. The blood drained from Barrett's face so quickly that Officer Chen took an instinctive step forward, worried he might faint. The crowd, sensing the shift in power dynamics, pressed closer despite the steady rain. Thompson remained perfectly still, water rolling off his expensive suit, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Please, Officer Barrett." Thompson's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who knew he'd won before the game even began. "Do continue. I believe you'll find the contents most enlightening." Page 1 should be particularly interesting. It's a detailed record of every racial profiling complaint filed against you in the past 5 years. Barrett's hands shook more violently now as he opened the folder. Photographs spilled out, dozens of them. Images of him conducting stops, all following the same pattern, the same demographic, the same abuse of power. Each photo was dated, time-stamped, and annotated with witness statements. "What?" Barrett's voice cracked. "What is this?" "That, Officer Barrett," Thompson replied, pulling out his phone and checking the time, "is your legacy of discrimination, documented meticulously by my team over the past 18 months. The folder beneath it contains your official dismissal papers, which, I might add, you've just authenticated by illegally accessing." Officer Chen had backed away completely now, her rookie instincts screaming that she needed to distance herself from what was unfolding. The crowd's murmurs had grown louder, and several courthouse employees were nodding in recognition. They'd witnessed Barrett's behavior before, but had never seen justice served so perfectly. "You can't," Barrett started, but his voice failed him as he noticed the police commissioner's signature at the bottom of the dismissal letter. The date on it was tomorrow's. This had been planned, timed, orchestrated down to the minute. Thompson reached into his suit pocket and retrieved another phone, not his personal one, but an official police department-issued device. "Commissioner Davis." Yes, he took the bait. Exactly as predicted. "We have multiple witnesses and video evidence of an illegal stop and search, culminating in the unauthorized access of confidential department documents." He paused, listening. "Yes, sir. Right away." 2 internal affairs officers, who had been waiting in plainclothes among the crowd, stepped forward. Their badges glinted in the rain as they approached Barrett, whose face had taken on an ashen hue. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He hadn't been conducting a stop. He'd been walking into an elaborate trap. Officer James Barrett, one of the IA officers, announced formally, "Please surrender your badge and weapon. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending termination, effective tomorrow morning." Barrett stood frozen, rain dripping from his chin, the damning folder still open in his hands. Years of unchecked authority, of justified complaints, of warnings ignored. It had all led to this moment, this public undoing. Thompson carefully took back his briefcase, removing the folder with Barrett's name and handing it to the IA officers. "If you'll excuse me," he said, checking his watch one final time, "I have a federal case waiting." "And Officer Barrett." He paused, making eye contact with the man whose career he just ended. "The case I'm presenting today. It's a class action lawsuit against police departments with patterns of racial profiling. Your documentation will make an excellent addition to the evidence." With that, Thompson climbed the courthouse steps, leaving behind a stunned Barrett, a relieved crowd, and the steady sound of rain washing away 15 years of unchecked power. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a stark contrast to yesterday's rain. The Memphis Police Department's main conference room buzzed with tension as Commissioner Davis stood at the podium, facing a sea of reporters. The wall behind him displayed a large screen showing multiple video angles of Barrett's confrontation with Thompson from the previous day. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commissioner Davis began, his voice grave, "what you've witnessed is not just the end of one officer's career, but the beginning of a new era in our department." He gestured to Marcus Thompson, who sat composed and dignified at his right, still emanating the same quiet authority that had disarmed Barrett. Thompson rose smoothly, adjusting his tie. A different suit today, but equally impeccable. "For the past 18 months, he addressed the packed room, I've served as the head of a covert task force investigating systematic racial profiling within the Memphis Police Department. What happened yesterday was the culmination of Operation Mirror, designed to catch officers who abused their authority in the act. Photographs appeared on the screen behind him, dozens of them showing Barrett's previous stops, each one meticulously documented. Officer Barrett wasn't randomly profiling me yesterday, Thompson continued. He was selected based on extensive data analysis, civilian complaints, and internal reports. We knew he would take the bait. The reporters leaned forward, furiously taking notes as Thompson clicked through to the next slide. It showed a complex flowchart of the department's command structure, with red marks indicating officers under investigation. The briefcase he illegally searched contained more than just his dismissal papers. We have documentation on 17 other officers who have demonstrated similar patterns of behavior. In the back of the room, several senior officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thompson's eyes swept over them, knowingly, before he continued. But this isn't just about removing bad actors. It's about transforming the entire system. Commissioner Davis stepped forward again. Mr. Thompson isn't just a civil rights attorney. As of this morning, he's been appointed as the head of our new Police Oversight Committee, with full authority to implement departmental reforms. The room erupted with questions, camera flashes illuminating Thompson's composed face. A veteran reporter from the Memphis Daily stood up. Mr. Thompson, was putting yourself at risk yesterday really necessary? Couldn't these officers be removed through normal channels? Thompson's response was measured but firm. Sometimes, the most effective way to expose systemic racism is to let it reveal itself. Officer Barrett didn't just lose his job yesterday. He provided irrefutable evidence of how deeply these biases run in law enforcement. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Every officer who stopped me during this operation saw the same thing. A black man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase near the courthouse. Their assumptions, their actions, their abuse of power, it's all documented. But yesterday's incident was unique because Officer Barrett did exactly what we predicted. He violated my rights so blatantly that no one can deny what happened. The screen behind him switched to live footage from police training sessions already in progress. As we speak, every officer in this department is undergoing mandatory retraining. Those who pass will be part of the new Memphis PD. Those who don't. He let the implication hang in the air. Commissioner Davis stepped back to the podium. Thanks to Mr. Thompson's work, Memphis will become a model for police reform across the nation. The days of unchecked authority are over. In the audience, Officer Chen sat quietly, her rookie badge still gleaming. She thought about Barrett's face when he'd opened that briefcase, about all the times she'd wanted to speak up but hadn't. On her laptop, she'd already started typing her own report about other incidents she'd witnessed. Thompson noticed her determined expression and gave her a subtle nod. This was the real victory, not just removing officers like Barrett, but inspiring the next generation to do better, to be better. As camera flashes continued to light up the room, Thompson straightened his Harvard law ring, the same ring that had caught Barrett's attention just yesterday. Sometimes, he reflected, justice wears a suit and carries a briefcase, but it never loses its power to change the world. James Barrett sat at his kitchen table, staring at the morning's newspaper. His own face stared back at him from the front page, captured in the moment he'd opened Thompson's briefcase. The headline read, Operation Mirror. How one lawyer exposed systematic police profiling. His coffee had gone cold, untouched since his wife had silently placed it before him 2 hours ago. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from fellow officers, some offering sympathy, others quietly distancing themselves. The screen lit up again. His union representative, probably calling to tell him what he already knew. There would be no appeal, no defense, no way to spin this. The evidence was too perfect, too public, too damning. Jim, his wife Susan, spoke softly from the doorway. Your daughter's on the line. Rachel wants to know if you're still coming to her graduation ceremony next week. The unspoken question hung in the air. How would his presence affect her moment? now that his disgrace was public. Barrett pushed away from the table, the chair legs scraping against linoleum. The sound reminded him of handcuffs scraping against his belt, a sound he'd never make again. "Tell her," his voice cracked. "Tell her I'll watch from the live stream." The TV in the living room droned on, covering the press conference live. Thompson's voice carried through the house. "This isn't about one officer or one incident. This is about accountability at every level." Barrett's hands clenched into fists as he recognized the voice that had so calmly orchestrated his downfall. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from Chen. "I'm sorry, but I have to tell them everything. All the stops, all the times you told me to look the other way. They're interviewing every rookie you've trained." The walls of Barrett's carefully constructed world were crumbling faster than he could process. 15 years of service reduced to a cautionary tale. His pension, his reputation, his future, all destroyed because he couldn't resist stopping that one man with the briefcase. The doorbell rang, making Barrett jump. Through the window, he saw news vans parked along his street. Neighbors peeked through curtains, watching the spectacle unfold. Susan moved to answer it, but Barrett caught her arm. "Don't," he whispered. "Just don't." His phone lit up with another message, this time from Commissioner Davis himself. "The department's full report goes public at noon. You might want to stay off social media for a while." Barrett glanced at the clock. 30 minutes until this complete professional autopsy would be available for the world to see. Looking around his home, Barrett noticed for the first time how many photos showed him in uniform. Proud moments, ceremonies, commendations, all tainted now. In each one, he saw what Thompson had seen. Not a dedicated officer, but a man drunk on authority, using his badge to justify his biases. The TV continued its relentless coverage. They were interviewing people he'd stopped over the years, their stories forming a damning pattern he could no longer deny. Each account matched Thompson's documentation perfectly. The same approaches, the same assumptions, the same abuse of power. "I need some air," Barrett muttered, heading for the back door. But even his own backyard offered no escape. A drone hummed overhead, probably news footage for the evening report. His neighbor, who used to bring over beer and watch football games, quickly turned away when their eyes met across the fence. Susan followed him outside, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What do we do now, Jim?" The question carried the weight of their mortgage, their daughter's college tuition, their entire future. Barrett sank into a patio chair, the metal cold against his back. In his pocket, his phone buzzed one final time. A text from an unknown number. "Officer Barrett, my office is preparing a comprehensive report on police reform. Would you be willing to contribute? Your perspective as a case study could help prevent others from following the same path. Marcus Thompson." The message blurred as Barrett's eyes welled up. Even now, Thompson was 3 steps ahead, turning Barrett's disgrace into a teaching tool. The ultimate irony. His biggest failure would become his lasting legacy in law enforcement, just not in the way he'd ever imagined. 1 month after Operation Mirror made national headlines, the Memphis Police Department's training facility bustled with unprecedented activity. In the main lecture hall, Marcus Thompson stood before a new class of recruits, Barrett's briefcase positioned prominently on the podium beside him. The room was silent except for the soft whir of ceiling fans and the scratch of pens on notepads. "This briefcase," Thompson began, running his hand along its leather surface, "isn't just evidence anymore. It's become a symbol of transformation." Behind him, the screen displayed the now famous photos of Barrett's final stop. But what you might not know is that there were 23 other briefcases that day, carried by 23 other black professionals across the city. Only one officer took the bait. A young recruit raised her hand. "Sir, how did you know Officer Barrett would be the one?" Thompson smiled, pulling out a thick file. "Because people like Barrett follow patterns. For 3 months, we had attorneys of color walk past his patrol area. He stopped 47% of them. Not one white attorney was stopped during the same period. The statistics flashed on the screen behind him, drawing gasps from the recruits. Across town, at a small diner away from the media's attention, Officer Chen sat across from Rachel Barrett, the former officer's daughter. Rachel stirred her coffee absently, her graduation tassel still hanging from her rearview mirror outside. "Dad's not doing well," Rachel confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hasn't left the house in weeks. Mom's worried he might." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Chen reached across the table, squeezing Rachel's hand. "The department's offering counseling services, not just for him, but for families too." Thompson insisted on it, said reform isn't just about punishment, it's about healing. Back at the training facility, Thompson had moved on to the implementation phase of the reforms. Every officer now wears an eye-enhanced body camera that flags potential bias in real time, he explained, holding up the new equipment. But technology isn't the solution. It's just a tool. The real change has to come from within. In the back of the room, Commissioner Davis watched with satisfaction. The department's complaint rates had dropped 60% in just 1 month. More significantly, minority communities were reporting increased trust in law enforcement. The Thompson method, as it was being called, was drawing attention from police departments nationwide. At home, Barrett sat in his study, staring at Thompson's business card. He'd received it in a letter last week, along with an unexpected proposal. Thompson wanted him to join the training program, not as an officer, but as a cautionary voice, the living example of how bias can corrupt even veteran officers. His phone lit up with a text from Rachel. "Dad, I just left coffee with Chen. Please consider Mr. Thompson's offer. Your story could help change things." Meanwhile, local news crews gathered outside the courthouse where it all began. Thompson stood on the same steps where Barrett had stopped him, addressing a crowd of reporters. "Today, we're announcing the creation of the Civil Rights Protection Unit within the Memphis PD. Its sole purpose is to ensure that what happened here never happens again." The cameras panned to show a diverse group of officers standing behind him, the unit's first members. Among them stood Officer Chen, her new badge reflecting the afternoon sun. She'd been personally selected by Thompson after her detailed testimony about Barrett's past behaviors had helped identify other officers needing intervention. "Some have asked why we chose such a public method of exposure," Thompson continued, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "The answer is simple. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. By making Barrett's case so public, we forced every department in the country to look in the mirror." As evening fell, Thompson returned to his office, placing Barrett's briefcase in a glass display case. Beside it, he positioned a new plaque reading, "Change begins with reflection." His phone buzzed. A message from Barrett. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to take you up on your offer. My story needs to be told." Thompson smiled, recognizing that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from those who've lost the most. The briefcase had closed on Barrett's career, but it had opened the door to real change. 6 months after Operation Mirror, the Memphis Police Department's annual community forum painted a very different picture from years past. The convention center buzzed with energy as citizens, officers, and community leaders gathered to discuss the transformation that had swept through the city's law enforcement. At the center of it all stood an unlikely pair, Marcus Thompson and James Barrett. The former officer, now noticeably thinner and grayer but standing straighter than he had in months, adjusted his civilian tie before stepping up to the podium. The room fell silent. "My name is James Barrett." His voice wavered slightly. "And 6 months ago, I was the example of everything wrong with policing." He glanced at Thompson, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Today, I'm something else. A warning, a lesson, and hopefully, part of the solution." The audience, initially skeptical, leaned forward as Barrett began sharing his story. Not the public version they'd all seen on the news, but the deeper truth. How power had corrupted him so gradually he hadn't noticed, how bias had disguised itself as instinct, how authority had become an addiction. In the front row, Officer Chen sat beside Rachel Barrett, both women watching with tears in their eyes as Barrett laid bare his transformation. "The hardest part wasn't losing my badge," he continued. "It was facing my own daughter and admitting that the uniform I taught her to respect had become a shield for my prejudice." Thompson stepped up beside Barrett, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Change," Thompson addressed the crowd, "doesn't always come from policy manuals or training sessions. Sometimes it comes from watching someone confront their own failures with courage." The screen behind them displayed the department's latest statistics. Complaints down 78%, community trust up 64%, and most significantly, a 90% reduction in racially motivated stops. But the real change was visible in the faces of the young officers scattered throughout the audience, their expressions showing understanding rather than defense. "We've trained over 200 departments nationwide," Thompson continued, gesturing to a map showing Operation Mirror's expanding influence. "But Memphis leads the way because we didn't just change procedures, we changed hearts." Barrett's briefcase, now a permanent installation in the police academy's main hall, had become required viewing for every new recruit. They would stand before it, watching video of that rainy day, listening to Barrett himself explain how a 15-year veteran had become the catalyst for national reform. As the forum continued, Rachel Barrett approached the podium to share her perspective. "My father's actions hurt our family deeply," she began, her voice strong. "But his response to that hurt, his willingness to become a voice for change, that's taught me more about integrity than any number of commendations ever could." In the back of the room, Commissioner Davis watched with satisfaction. The department had become a model for reform, with delegations from across the country visiting to study the Memphis Miracle, as the media had dubbed it. What they found wasn't just new policies or procedures, but a fundamental shift in culture. As the forum drew to a close, Thompson made one final announcement. "Today, we're launching the Barrett-Thompson Initiative for Police Accountability." He turned to Barrett, who looked stunned. Sometimes, the most powerful advocates for change are those who've experienced both sides of the badge. The crowd rose in a standing ovation as Barrett, overwhelmed, shook Thompson's hand. 6 months ago, these men had been adversaries in a carefully orchestrated confrontation. Now they were partners in reform, their unlikely alliance a testament to the possibility of real change. Outside the convention center, as the sun set on Memphis, Officer Chen prepared for her patrol. Her new AI-enhanced body camera activated automatically, but it was hardly needed anymore. The lessons of Operation Mirror had become part of the department's DNA. Thompson and Barrett walked out together, stopping at the steps where their story had begun. "You know," Barrett said quietly, "I never thank you for destroying my career." He smiled slightly. "It saved my soul." Thompson nodded, understanding the weight of those words. The briefcase that had ended one chapter had opened another, not just for these two men, but for departments across the nation. As they stood there, a young black lawyer hurried past, briefcase in hand. The new officers on duty simply smiled and waved him through, a small gesture that spoke volumes about how far they'd come and how far they could still go.